Hello, this is James. Welcome back. First of all, thanks for the very warm reception on the previous video. I'm sure that most of these won't do anywhere near as well as that, like view-wise, but it's nice to at least know that there does still exist like a latent audience for CTs out there in the ether somewhere. Now you may want to know, first of all, why I'm playing a war this episode, and that's because this actually did take place in Lounge, so to that end, this recording that you're watching is actually from the end of last season of Lounge, that is, not CTL, even though it's a war. It was one of the last scheduled squad queues of the season. This was the CT 5v5 squad queue as a way of drumming up attention for CTL season 12, which was still upcoming at the time. And we're still in the midst of season 12 at the time. And this was from room 1 against N. There were 5 or 6 rooms, so the squad queue actually did quite well. So it's nice that we were able to be in room 1. And as for how things went for us in the war, well, you'll see. Also, yeah, Psycho and Hazard were bagging on Quacker. But this video isn't about CTL Season 12 because I think I have enough to say about Season 12 and the GSC demerge to make its own video. You know, the hardest part about making this series isn't just trying to come up with topics, but also having to distribute all of my thoughts into videos that both stay somewhat on topic without falling for my own neurologically induced trap where I'd veer off into any kind of train of thought. And I either end up having, too much or too little to say. I was still going by the end of last video. I may still be going by the end of this video. We'll see. Anyways, this particular 5v5 queue kind of caps off the CTL Season 11 era and ushers in the new Season 12 era. But I haven't talked about Season 11 yet, have I? Something to note about Season 11, though, is that I never uploaded anything for it, which you'd have expected me to do, considering the fact that I did make a video on Season 9 and made 2 videos on Season 10. And it's not like I didn't record anything, or that I wasn't playing. I didn't upload anything for the season simply because I thought that the season was boring. I felt in Season 11 like I was playing the same thing that I'd played in Season 10, but worse and less fun. But regardless, it was a larger league with more signups than the previous season, so I was certainly on my own as far as that opinion went. Although the fact that we didn't even make playoffs, I'm sure also contributed to that decision to not make a video on it, just from a demotivational perspective. Because I wanted to repeat the same pattern where I'd upload a video of the main season followed by a video of the playoffs like I did in Season 10. But then again, I guess I could disagree with that perspective because I came up with the idea to make another meme video like with Season 9 because we lost again and it was fucking hilarious. Well, Season 11 wasn't funny actually. It was mostly just depressing, sad, and boring, and even reps wise it was kind of boring because we were actually scheduling matches on time and weren't getting flamed by the entire div, which is interesting because now this season we had rep issues again and staff had to try and get us back onto a human schedule. But anyways, I'll fully delve into the topic of Season 11, the format of Season 11 now, and I'll divide this into 2 overarching ideas. The first is the subjugation of all tracks format itself, and the second is the tracks that were banned going into the season. I think that Season 11 can be conceptualized as the tail end of this GSC CTL merge era that used to exist prior to Season 12. But there were 3 major changes to the rule set from previous seasons that resulted in a far greater change to the meta than any minor rule set changes from previous seasons like individual track bans, which I imagine at least weren't intended to have as widespread of an impact as they actually did. The first is the way that all tracks was subverted. Second is the changes to the ban list, the 2 tracks that were banned, as well as how the process of bans is carried out. And third, technically the most minor, but still worth mentioning, I might discuss this in my Season 12 video, is the shortened season. It's from 10 weeks down to 8 weeks, so you have to play 2 matches in a week twice. I won't give any further mention to this, like I said, until Season 12, but just recall and note that it did result in an underlying widespread psychological change to the way that we think about the definition of a CT season in general. In Season 10, I would say we had probably the last season ever of what I could refer to as true all tracks. Now, true all tracks isn't just a rule set with regards to what tracks can be picked under the existing list of unbanned tracks, but it's also a mentality towards the league in general that involves keeping as many tracks unbanned as possible. Season 10 was the last season before the Skyline Avenue and Aqua Dungeon bans, and that's because, after Season 10, staff began to intervene much more heavily in meta-related matters. Now, I honestly completely disagree with this notion of staff intervening in the meta so much. Hang on, let me pause the commentary here. You can all get a great look at this. Ground shroom, -20. Just kidding. Baggers have the right to take ground shrooms. I'm egged, then comboed, and egged again. Wait for it. Yep. Nice fucking track. Like I said, staff began to intervene way more heavily in meta-related matters following Season 10, which I disagree with because it goes against what's existed in CT culture in the past, as well as just MKW's overarching culture. And it ultimately contributes in small part to MKW not really being particularly distinguished from other games with this mentality that the meta needs to be intervened with so heavily. Because let's consider Nintendo's other games in the recent era of online patches that receive regular meta balances and nerfs that are designed to deliberately reshape the meta of the entire game with no consideration for how the previously existing meta was enjoyable or may have existed without the need for any balance changes. Just look how MK8D was ruined by the balance overhauls that came alongside the arrival of the DLC. Game was already dog shit regardless, but Nintendo's balance teams for their games simply saw that certain vehicles were more frequently utilized or were unbalanced with regards to the other vehicles and made changes without paying heed as to whether or not those changes actually contributed to a better game. I would even say that it's like a cultural issue, and as far as games as like MKW and Melee go, these games are special precisely because they don't receive balance changes, and the meta can evolve within like a stable and predefined set of rules and circumstances, which thereby make them more conducive to this hyper-competitive refinement process that we've seen in MKW and Melee. I'll probably make that like concept the topic of another video in the future, but for now it's just important to understand that it's something that should be upheld culturally within MKW's competitive institutions so as to not heavily interfere with the meta too much. Now, one could argue that CTGP as a whole, with its like track removals and recent history of broken updates, no respect for its history, result in new tracks oftentimes being banned for playability issues. This would thereby be an example of a system in which game-changing decisions and meta-changing decisions are made out of the general community's hands. But I would honestly argue that CTL exists under this wider banner of like CTGP as a whole, and that it merely has to contend with what decisions the council chooses to make. It shouldn't necessarily be contributive to the approach that CTL staff take to running their league. However, all of what I've just said is mostly just a primer for the topic of track bans, which I'll get into later. I'll get back to the change to all tracks format, since that's supposed to be the first subtopic, and then I'll zero in on Skyline and Aqua Dungeon afterwards. Going into Season 11, easily the most divisive issue was whether or not all tracks format warranted another season of playtime. Every season where the format is retained from the previous season will inevitably see these kinds of discussions crop up. But then, suddenly, something completely groundbreaking happened out of the blue. In the midst of a typical daily discussion, an idea was presented to the staff team by ACT, who's on CS, which is a team that's historically supported tracklist in the past. And whereas the response by most tracklist supporters in the wake of the seasonally held format vote is to just mindlessly bitch and moan about playing a format that a super majority of people usually vote for, ACT instead came up with an idea that will most likely change how CT leagues are played forever. In a traditional div, you play each team in the div twice in a round-robin format, which is called a double round-robin, and everyone who plays leagues knows this. But ACT's idea was that in the second round-robin matches, in all tracks format, the 12 tracks that you played during your first round-robin match would be ineligible to be picked again. And since Season 11 was going to be yet another all-track season, the managers decided to implement this as a new rule. Although I'm personally going to spend the entire video defining it as an entirely new format because it completely alters how main season matches are played at a fundamental level. I'm calling this new Season 11 All Tracks Alteration No Rematch Repicks format, or NRR for short. Now in Season 10, we in Triton had a set of tracks we'd stick to, which we have already stuck to for a very long time. We pick very traditional comp CTGP core tracks and aren't very gimmicky like many other teams. If you watch my Season 10 videos, you'll see a flurry of like Skyline, Crystal Dungeon, Aqua Dungeon, etc. We didn't have a game plan beyond just picking the tracks that we'd historically been good at, with a few exceptions like Aqua Dungeon, since we were still operating under the assumption that 2-3 tracks can even still exist in a post-CTGP lag start fix, quote-unquote fix era. And Aqua Dungeon is also a great track, of course. But there's one thing that should be obvious, and that's that the potential for abuse is there, despite the fact that we didn't personally capitalize upon it. Within the throes of CTGP's gimmick era, the inherent possibility for tracks to completely abuse, like teams to completely abuse their tracks 10 for 10 in the main season presents what could very well be considered to be an uncompetitive edge. Now here's where I have to be honest, because I changed my opinion in the process of drafting the notes for this video. I was originally going to spend some time in this video decrying how the subversion was forced upon us, and that the community should have been given the opportunity to vote for whether or not to play no rematch repicks, just like how we're provided with the opportunity to vote for the format every season, and that it's critical that we don't conflate NRR with true all tracks. But then as I continued to format more ideas for the video, I came to the conclusion of just how wrong I was to even consider it along those lines. And here's what I wrote initially. The same methodology that leads to track votes every season, which quote-unquote all tracks won handily going into seasons 11 and 12, that methodology being to ensure that a vocal minority doesn't indirectly influence the staff team by an incongruent amount compared to the number of silent observers who would just prefer to play all tracks, should also be applied under the staff team so as to ensure that the staff members themselves don't follow the wrong kind of mental heuristics when editing the rule set, end quote. Whatever the fuck that means that I wrote. But you see, if this were an IRL discussion where I was holding a piece of paper in my hands, I'll just throw it up in the air and tell James US from 2 months ago to stop coping because there's nothing that he can say. It's more competitive. That's the end of the story. There's no vote for something that's as unprecedented as this idea. The mere idea of voting against no rematch repicks would be to explicitly state that you don't have a competitive mentality, and that the idea of an advancing and evolving meta is less important to you than being able to pick the same slop CTs that you've spammed in previous seasons against the same teams. There are oftentimes ideas in history that completely shape how an entire population views the world around them, and this is like the MKW custom track equivalent of that. The reason why it's impossible for a competitive player to vote against no rematch repicks in good faith is the same reason why you can't oppose the concepts of progress and collective advancement within a meta itself in good faith. Because what are you going to do? Sit there and say you disagree? Because it makes you sad that you can't pick melting magma every match against every team? The intellectualism and meta progressing nature inherent to NRR speaks for itself. So it speaks for itself, right? Well, I have to talk for 30 minutes, so I'll actually explain why. You see, here's how matches were played within the true all tracks rule set that formerly existed prior to Season 11. Teams would have a handful of tracks within their arsenal, pick them while perhaps throwing a few wild cards into the mix or picking tracks that they know are going to fare well against specific teams, and if they initially found themselves doing well in the season, continue to just do what they'd done previously going into the second round robin. In Triton's case, we've picked the same tracks for our entire CTL career since Season 8 and even long prior to it. But suddenly, with no rematch repicks, that monotony is broken. We only get one Final Grounds pick per team per main season, and only one Abyssal Ruins pick, only one Delfino Island, and so on. Now we're on the receiving end of a complete culture shock where the lack of depth in our track selection is exposed for just what it is, and we've had to try and find ways to cope with that. It's also a constant struggle to have to balance not wanting to waste certain tracks within the first round robin match against a team with the necessity of actually winning and not having thrown our match as a result of a track pick that we weren't entirely comfortable on. And that's the beauty of NRR. It forces you to think through every track pick and gives an overarching sense of grand strategy to each match, even in the main season. And one team that I think demonstrates the difference in strategy that goes into NRR in Season 11 was Rise. They had a set of a few tracks like Spooky Swamp, Starry Cityscape, Ribbon Road that we got completely destroyed on in our first match. But when the second match rolled around, they were struggling to find anything to pick, and we didn't have to feel like we desperately needed track picks just to stay above water in the races, because they failed to distribute their best tracks properly over the 2 matches, and were overly heavy upon track picks in the first match. It's also that sense of having to methodically withhold tracks that is another reason that I like it from a conceptual standpoint. Ever since the dawn of playoffs format, people like BA Jamie have been arguing that it's a complete disgrace to all the work that teams do in the main season to place well, just to have a single BO3 determine who gets the glory in the end. And obviously, while NRR doesn't address that issue, because for all its meta shapingness, it's technically just a single track pick related clause on top of an existing rule set, it does give the entire season the same feeling that playoffs do, wherein you'll be engaging in the same kind of track conservation that you will be in playoffs, and it's things like that that help give the main season less of a sense of disconnection when compared to playoffs. But I'm also not going to deny that there is something that is profoundly lost to the culture when the idea of playing a track more than 5 times in a main season is lost. I really do think that it's fascinating that the CT meta over time has always coagulated into a set of just a few tracks down from 218 that represent the highest picked echelon in the meta. And in Season 10, Skyline perfectly fit that bill. And that's what I'd wanted to get at initially when I wrote about what's lost in the wake of NRR. Because it's fun to play the same shit. It's fun and a lot less mentally taxing to have a small reserve of tracks that you can rely on without needing to spread yourself too thin. And now, with no rematch repicks, it's a constant mental battle of, should we save this or pick it now? Let's pick this. Oh, wait, did we already play that? Okay, we did, nice. And it is sad to think that there's nothing we can do in the face of this new format. But regardless of any sentimental feelings that we may hold towards the true all-tracks format that used to exist, it's undeniable that NRR is the overarching clause beneath which, going forwards, the format that we call all tracks will exist under. It's a cultural paradigm shift as a result of the underlying ideas and assumptions behind true all tracks simply being outmoded by newer and objectively more competitive ideas. It's completely synonymous with the idea of the advancement of a meta itself, but with the format instead of anything in game. And sometimes the advancement of a meta itself can result in less enjoyment. But over time, I think we'll all naturally learn to play around this new format as it exists in its current state, and things will gradually gain a sense of stability as it becomes easier from a purely neurological standpoint to do things like recalling what you've picked already and having a greater spread of available tracks as a team. And when that happens, we'll know that we successfully managed to advance ourselves competitively as a community, as true all tracks becomes a distant nostalgic memory. And that's the end. But continuing on, because that wasn't the only major change going into Season 11, I called it a paradigm shift in the title, and while no rematch repicks is a major part of that communal swing, it still doesn't paint the full picture. So let's talk about track bans. As I mentioned previously, on the cusp of Season 11, it was announced that Skyline Avenue and Aqua Dungeon would be banned going into the season, which now makes them the 5th and 6th comp banned tracks, in addition to the previously existing and seemingly set in stone, at least before Season 10 saw an immense amount of bitching about supposed uncompetitive loopholes in the format, set of 4 bans, those being CTR Cortex Castle, Engine Labs, Wario Coliseum, and N64 Wario. Now, first of all, it's very easy to reach this kind of conclusion wherein you see your own team's success followed by a council sanction on that success and get the idea that you're being singled out. But whether or not that's actually true, it's nice to at least know that we aren't alone in Triton and getting fucked over. MI can also raise their hand in the back and be like, hey guys, council also fucked us over when they banned DS Wario in previous seasons and N64 Wario because our race records on them were too good. And the thing that differentiates Season 12 when compared to 11 from a track ban perspective is that every explicitly quote-unquote broken track that existed within the meta, within any kind of popular echelon, had already been stamped out going into the season by the same kind of overly draconian approach to track bans that caught N64 Wario in the crossfire all that time ago. DS Wario's unban was pretty much just a serendipitous realization by Council that they had overstepped their bounds, which hasn't been witnessed again since. But, once again, something to note is that both of the so-called broken tracks that were abused in the Season 10 meta that were later banned in Season 11 were actually quite traditional when looked at specifically from the perspective of, is this or is this not a complete cringelord gimmick track? Skyline, Aqua Dungeon, and obviously N64 Wario are all tracks that not even the staunchest track knowledge meta critics like Dermo have ever complained about, at least while taking the same approach that they take to their usual track criticisms, because the design standards that went into them were all completely orthodox and are very antithetical to the kind of gimmickiness that we've seen crop up in the meta over the course of Seasons 11 and 12 in the wake of their bans. We had N picking Rosalie in a snow world and underground sky, MI with Frantic Funyard and Bluster Blob, Rise with Ribbon Road, and SV this season with all the dog shit they pick like 4F and post Shroomless Removal Melting. I mean, I could go on, but you get the point. And I already mentioned the CTGP Council's part in this, so let's just put that to the side for a moment and analyze it exclusively from the perspective of bans. Now, first of all, let me be clear that I don't believe that the CTL staff's approach to bans was what contributed to this gimmick trend, but what it does do is help to cement it from a cultural perspective. If it could be argued that there still exists some potentially ban-worthy tracks that still exist within the ether of CTGP, let's say like SNES BC3 for instance, then it stands to reason that the first team to abuse it within an all-track season will also be the last team to abuse it within the season that track is unbanned for. This is an obvious enough observation on its own, considering the fact that the staff already carefully monitor the meta like I talked about near the beginning of the video. But I also know it to be the case because it's exactly what happened in Season 10 to us when playing versus members of the Council on Aqua Dungeon, which I'll make the first case study before I talk about Skyline. Our average race on Aqua was very good. We top 3'd it multiple times, and it was by far one of our best tracks. But after one of our matches against DS Capstone, which is a team whose members have mostly spread to either N or SV nowadays, in which we top 3'd them on it, we were met with a bunch of messages after the race saying like, oh, well, good thing we're getting that banned next season, Triton's getting nerfed. Now, first of all, I'd like to say that I'm not going to like name any names here because I made the explicit decision not to be toxic in the series because it would just be trashy and make for worse rewatchability. And secondly, this all happened 2 seasons ago, so it's water under the bridge regardless, even if I still cared. But even though I don't harbor any personal feelings toward it, I must say that this kind of mentality with like specific regard to these supposedly broken tracks, I think it's fair game to criticize people who can only win on gimmicks, doesn't make sense when you consider just how much discussion has been held over a very long period of time with regards to what tracks within the pack are ban-worthy, including preemptive comp viability discussions amongst the CTGP Track Council, which does have a good number of forward-thinking competitive players to be facilitative of good discussion. But with that being said, I'll give Aqua in particular a pass on this, just because it's something new. You know, it's comparatively new. It existed within the meta, and it was, you know, it showed that it was supposedly broken. It's kind of hard to structure my thoughts on it, but I'll just start at the beginning of the track itself, and I will veer very quickly off into a tangent, because the thing about Aqua Dungeon is that going into Season 10, since it was relatively new, it was viewed as a 2-3 track. But as I mentioned earlier, CTs, over the course of the past few years, in the wake of the lag start fix, quote-unquote fix, have been on a very sharp decline. And I'd say I first noticed this in the wake of old Hell Pyramids removal in early 2021, where the only track that you could really point to specifically as like an exclusively beneficial 2-3 track that also noticeably disadvantaged first that existed within the meta was Dark Matter Shrine, which is very lag reliant and inconsistent by its very nature because of the beginning cut, even if you don't factor in the impact of broken lag starts. When you do factor in the impact of broken lag starts and the completely inconsistent nature of what happens within the first second of the race since the lag start update, I wouldn't hesitate to say that 2-3 tracks have mostly gone extinct, or at least deserve the classification of endangered species, when compared and considered over the course of that 2021 update that removed Old Hill Pyramid and Bayside Boulevard to right now, especially when you compare the current meta around whatever 2-3 tracks might still exist to the very noticeable first place killers of the late 2010s like Sparkly Road, Bayside Boulevard again, Old Rainbow Road Solar, etc. Because the beginnings of the races weren't fundamentally broken. So all of that to say, right off the bat on Aqua Dungeon, you have a track that wasn't even working as advertised for its supposed purpose as a first place killer, because the top 3 players don't even start at the same time and haven't started on time for years, thereby allowing first to just align hard right. And since it's the case in practicality that first can just maintain, the reasoning behind banning it, falling in line with the idea that the meta needs to have certain sanctions upon it, such that certain tracks don't become the only realistic option for certain positions, completely fails to meet that metric, because the chances of maintaining 2-3 may as well just be determined by a coin toss at the beginning of the race. It's not consistent, which would be a prerequisite to it potentially being overpowered. But, with that being said, anyone who wants to get a box at the first set, which is usually cited as like the bona fide ban reason, has to go around the beginning ramp and lose time. And from there, you have the quintessential running track with a few interesting back spots that are also facilitative of double backs, like the spiral and the turn after you exit the zapper section. However, there are 2 good golden spots, those being if you spam a golden right after you pull one at first set, and the second is after you land from the zapper section again. Which is also a good spot to shroom in general, because you can chain a box before the shroomless ending cut. But that is a non-existent argument in comparison to what I think actually matters, which is shock viability. If you pull shock at the beginning of laps 2 and 3 while top spots are going for the beginning big ramp, you can TS the entire enemy team midair on the big ramp while simultaneously getting yourself into boxes at first set. And if you want to see an example of this, and I'll also be using this race as an example, just go and watch my Season 10 D2 playoffs video and skip to our Match 1 finals against MI on Aqua Dungeon. It demonstrates the usage of that shock spot perfectly, especially considering the fact that MI weren't strangers to utilizing Aqua Dungeon either, and they knew exactly what to do in the scenario where we were up there. So we all get TS'd, but then we managed to make it back up there by the end of the race by just playing well for the duration of lap 3. It was a very good and competitive race that would in no way indicate to someone watching that they were witnessing a race on some kind of absurdly broken track that, like, insanely broken track, not even shock can help you catch up. But then after we get TS'd by shock on this supposedly broken track, we managed to catch back up. It isn't indicative at all of something that would be ban-worthy. Now, you could make the argument that shock being one of the only viable catch-up methods on the track is uncompetitive, but that's a dangerous argument to make because you'd be catching a very large number of tracks in the crossfire. After we got fucked by N, this team, in our Season 11 matches, I started to theorize to myself about how it's possible for tracks to exist in the meta that are so overpowered within the races on them themselves, but on paper don't meet any kind of ban-worthy criteria, which resulted in me coming up with a new definition, the Gambit track. The Gambit in question simply being that you're hoping to get shock and hold it, so as to turn a track that would otherwise be completely catch-up oriented into an overpowered running track. These are tracks like Post-Patch, Melting, Magma Melee, and especially Rosalina Snow World, which I'd say is the poster child for these kinds of tracks, because goldening up only works if you don't have to worry about back spams on sections like the huge U-turn around the chasm, and it's very easy to break away on. And if you were to argue that tracks that seemingly necessitate shock to break top spots are ban-worthy, you'd also be implying that N are somehow circumventing the underlying philosophy of the meta with their picks, but they aren't. They aren't abusing anything, because it's ostensibly just a track knowledge difference, and it could be well justifiably defended as that. Now, I was in the CTL server prior to Season 12 trying to start a discussion about Aqua Dungeon, just as many discussions have been held about banned tracks in the past. And interestingly, there was an argument that someone gave to me when I brought this topic up, which came from a pretty unexpected source. It wasn't a CTL council member defending the methodology that goes into track bans, or anyone who'd had like an uncompetitive experience. It was a backup bagger. It was IF Callum. And he mentioned to me that the reason why Aqua could still potentially be considered broken is because of the way that bagging it works. It's a sitting track that is like essentially a combination between like standoff tracks like Flying Kingdom and Rainbow Road from the actual game. But not in the sense that you're giving the other bagger a box in 10th every time you go for a box, but rather that if you do happen to pull Bill, you have to go back quite a ways to jump off, which thereby telegraphs to the other bagger that you have it, and you're giving them the opportunity to get uncontested boxes with Bill in play. And I actually found that a very interesting observation, considering the fact that nobody was really taking me seriously in the chat, so thanks to Callum for that. And that really threw a wrench in my argumentation. I'm not sure what to believe anymore. Maybe Aqua Dungeon really is an authentically ban-worthy track because of the natural hesitance that baggers would thereby have to even touch boxes, since it would harshly decrease the possibility of shocks coming on the big ramp if both baggers played with the awareness of the risk of pulling Bill in mind. But before I move on to discussing Skyline, I recalled, while I was typing the notes for the video, that I remember that something that I think Nathan said a while ago, who's on council in the CTL server, is that the council doesn't actually take shock into account when they're deciding upon if a track is ban-worthy. I could be taking that out of context, and I can't find the message either, so I'll just take that with a grain of salt. I just wanted to say something that I recalled seeing. So, Skyline Avenue. And here's a track that, it's been a meta staple for probably about twice the length of MKW playtime as the average viewer of this video, as far back as Xander's legendary CTWL Season 12 video of Relapse vs. FL, not to be confused with CTL Season 12, by the way. I'll link the video in the resources of the description if you somehow haven't seen it. There have been arguments mounted against Skyline for many years, practically since the idea of comp banning tracks existed, but they never really ended up sticking before Season 11. The primary points of interest being the main spiral, the turn in the casino, and the prevalence of boost panels on the track. This is a case of what I'd say is the opposite of Aqua Dungeon, in the sense that Aqua Dungeon is hard to qualitate on paper, whereas Skyline is very easy to qualitate on paper. It's been described as comprising 58% boost panels by Echo, which means that you spend 58% of the lap in a boost when you drive it properly, when he was attempting to get the track banned prior to Season 10, and most teams in the past have seemed to consider it a free win when starting in top spots. In the public chat prior to Season 10, Pepe actually decided to respond to Echo's statement with his own defense of Skyline just because it's one of his favorites. Pepe is someone who, like me many times in the past, probably once took inventory of every track within CTGP and decided that Skyline is one of the best first place picks for Lounge, which is obviously helpful to know if you host a lot in Lounge like he does. But in CTL, you can't get away with the habits that you pick up on in Lounge, like insta-trailing at first set and backing at every powerful spot every lap because you have teammates to contend with. So it requires more forethought than applying the same kind of GG he got his track pick mentality that you naturally would in Lounge. So in response to Echo, he said this: "The first two item sets are positioned in such a way that pretty much every player can get an item without losing much time. Assuming the team trying to catch up is not missing these items, which has nothing to do with the track, they are guaranteed, in all caps, to get an item that can shake up the race without having to make a crazy play. Even just triple shrooms can put you in a top 2 spot somewhat consistently. If the team is smart, they'll begin to cycle for blues early, and the 2 item sets on lap 1 after 30 seconds make early blues very common. Even if you fuck up the beginning or get super unlucky, the early amount of items gives, the large amount of items gives the opportunity for POWs and blues to be pulled, boost panels thereby making POWs extremely powerful. The back spam spots are not powerful enough to build a huge lead without mental or mechanical lapses, and I can go through alt lines for pretty much every common spot if needed. Also, bagging is completely skill-based, and shock is like always pulled. There's a lot of solid shock spots and 2 really good TS spots. The track is very strong for running, but it's not to the point where there's nothing you can do to catch up without ridiculous skill or luck, which I think should be the conditions for a track ban. I have a lot of races that I think prove this, and I'm sure I could find more from all levels of play." And just a end quote, by the way. And just a compound Pepe statement about anecdotal examples. I think out of every season in CTL history that could have been used as anecdotal evidence to ban Skyline, Season 10 had to have been the season with the single most laughably low rate of success for every team that picked it, which makes it all the more hilarious that it was banned in the interim leading up to Season 11. Double side trick, by the way. Niche. As an example of the failure of teams to do a thing on Skyline, in our third match against WZ in the D2 playoff semis of Season 10, which was such a boring race I didn't even bother uploading it, they picked it for top 4, and we managed to reverse top 4 them without even needing to do anything special. The running power really just isn't anywhere near what it's believed to be on Skyline. I don't even think that I need to add anything more apart from that personal experience, considering the fact that, Pepe expressed it very succinctly in his response. It's a very good response. As for whether I think that Aqua Dungeon or Skyline deserves to be unbanned more, I think it's hard to say because there are so many aspects to consider, and you really need to take the time to consider the all-encompassing entirety of how the track plays into account. But that confounding factor on Aqua Dungeon that I discussed earlier of it being a pseudo stalemate while Skyline is fully baggable kind of makes me lean more in the direction that Skyline should be unbanned first. So that concludes my thoughts on the advertised topic. With regards to all tracks format in Season 11, I think that summarizes most of the important thoughts that I had. And in videos like this where I talk about multiple topics, I kind of want to have a thesis statement that wraps everything up. So I guess the thesis for this video is that Season 11's alterations to all tracks format were indicative of a sort of cultural development of the CTL Council in terms of how they approach rule setting in the league as a whole, which served to push the council's approach to running the league more so in the direction of top-down changes being made on behalf of the community. And I was initially going to speak more about my thoughts on Season 11 in this video, but I decided to just hyper-focus in on one individual topic. And I was going to go into less detail about each subtopic, but I decided that I liked the idea of just really going into detail about a specific topic. So I'm going to save some adjacent thoughts from my video about Season 12, which may be coming next in the series, or it may not be. But regardless, I'm out of time, so here's another abrupt outro, and thank you for watching.